You can find people that you like and want to emulate and want to learn from, and you can model yourself after them, even if they're not biologically connected to you.
So what was growing up in that tradition like? Was it something talked about? Is it a set of values or stories that's passed down? Or is it just totally normal in the way that I don't really think of my great-great-grandfather very much?
I guess on the whole, I would say it was pretty normal. We didn't talk about it in my family, really. We did have a bunch of books about Theodore Roosevelt lying around, probably more than the ordinary family did. And so I read those because I just read every book in the house when I was growing up.
That's kind of a Roosevelt tradition.
Yeah, I guess so. And then, I don't know, my classmates teased me some. And when I was in fourth grade, they elected me president of the class because they were like, President Roosevelt, that makes sense. But then I like to think I did a good job anyway.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite quotes from Seneca, he says, we can't choose our parents, but we can choose whose children we would like to be. And I like this idea that the sort of family you're born into is not something you control, but you decide whether you follow the tradition or not, or whether you seek out a new, what parts of your family tree are you going to choose to come from? Even the Roosevelt family, right? There's the good side, and then there's also the alcoholism side and the philandering side, and the racism side. I mean, I guess there's a bunch of branches on that family tree, and you ultimately decide as an individual which ones you're gonna come from.
Yeah. And, I think you can find people that you like and want to emulate and want to learn from, and you can model yourself after them, even if they're not biologically connected to you.
Well, that was the Roman tradition that I didn't really understand much until later. But a family that didn't have a male son would often adopt a prominent man, sometimes well into adulthood, to sort of carry on the family tradition. So Seneca's brother, for instance, the reason that most people wouldn't identify him as a Seneca is, even though he's arguably more famous than Seneca, is because after he's adopted, he changes his name to Gaio, and he ends up in the Bible.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah. So he's that was a tradition, a famous tradition. You would adopt people. And so there was this idea that you would sort of identify with or be associated with different, groups or clans and sort of become part of it. And so I do like that idea that, people go, this person was my mentor. And we assume that they mean, you had a lot of direct conversations with that person. But I also feel like you could be mentored by or sort of in the tradition of someone that you've never met. You've just read them and studied them very deeply.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I would say that people have had very strong influences on me without me ever meeting them.
Yes.
Just reading them a lot.
Yeah. And the famous Stoic one similar to yours is Cato the Younger is actually the great grandson of Cato the Elder. So you think it's like a father and son situation, but they're separated by a very long period of history. So much so that when Stoicism comes to Rome from Greece, Cato the Elder is wants to ban the philosophers altogether. He thinks this philosophy is rock music or some sort of newfangled corrupting tradition. And then by the time his great-great-grandson gets it, it's the highest form of moral and civic excellence.
Like Taylor Swift.
Yes, exactly. So it's funny how that works out. But there's this tradition that they're following in, even though they would have disagreed severely on certain issues. He's still modeling himself after his great-great-grandfather. And then the subsequent Stoics sort of choose Cato as their grandfather.
Yeah.
Seneca says you have to choose yourself a Cato. Like, who's your ancestor that you're trying to continue their example or not let them down or follow in their footsteps? I think we have to do that.
Yeah. I think Theodore Roosevelt did that. I think that I felt that way growing up to some extent, because we had a lot of old books lying around.
Yeah.
So I read a fair amount of history and sort of classics. And yeah, I was kind of always looking for role models.
Was it, and then the family kind of seemed like it would go to the same schools. I'm sure there are sort of traditions or like things that felt like they tied you to that family lineage, right?
Schools, yeah, like college, definitely.
Yeah, because you're like, he went here.
Yeah. And there's a moose that he shot on the wall here.
Yes.
At the freshman dining hall.
Yeah.
Although, I was also thinking it was very different back then. So he did go here, like he walked along these streets, but it was a very different world also.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Harvard costs like $40.
Yes.
And it was a very different institution also, right? Like,
well, they really learned classics.
That's true.
And they boxed.
Yeah,
he did a lot more boxing than I did.
No boxing for you?
No boxing. I did take some Krav Maga more recently with my son.
That's a tradition that's coming back. I feel like my 6-year-old does Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah. Krav Maga is probably the worst martial art to teach a young child.
Why is that?
Though, well, because it's about inflicting maximum damage in minimum time. So it's the worst thing for them to like pull out in a playground scuffle. It's all like tiger claw, eye gouge, bite.
My 4-year-old jumped on me and did a jujitsu choke on me while I was in bed yesterday. And I was like, you don't even take jujitsu. You learn this from your brother. And then you're like, which is a move he's not even supposed to be learning yet. And somehow I'm getting choked out in my bed while I'm sleeping. What's going on? But
yeah. Well, yeah. So my son is 11 now. And it was great up until like 6 because I let him attack me.
Yeah.
And he couldn't hurt me. And I felt like invulnerable. And then when he got to like 8, I was like, wait, that's starting to hurt. And now I have to be like, don't hit me, don't hit me.
When I wrote the Daily Stoic 8 years ago, I had this crazy idea that I would just keep it going. The book was 366 meditations, but I'd write one more every single day and I'd give it away for free as an email. I thought maybe a few people would sign up. Couldn't have even comprehended a future in which 750,000 people would get this email every single day and would for almost a decade. If you want to get the email, if you want to be part of a community that is the largest group of Stoics ever assembled in human history, I'd love for you to join us. You can sign up and get the email totally for free. No spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want at dailystoic.com/email. Yeah, it's funny. But again, that's, I think, kind of an ancient tradition of like the sort of brood of feral children all trained in martial arts of some kind. There's something lovely. I got this from what I've read about the Theodore branch of the Roosevelts, that it was a very loud house.
Yeah, absolutely.
With a lot of mischief and a lot of animals and other forms
animals.
of craziness.
Animals in the White House.
Yes.
Horses in the elevator.
Yeah. And how have you thought about that tradition with your own kids? Like I'm just like I feel like, not that it matters, but most of us are just like regular people, right? There's not a particularly well-known lineage to explain, or here's your grandpa, he worked at a factory, right? Like, or grandma was a school teacher, right? There's not the more sort of historical story to go along with. How was that passed on to you, and then how have you thought about passing it on?
Well, I mostly got it from books. My parents didn't talk to me about it that much, but I did read about it, and I was like, wow, that sounds cool. That sounds like a lot of fun, playing point to point.
Was it deliberate, you think, that they didn't talk to you about it, or like a reaction to how it had been talked to
Honestly,
them?
yeah, I don't know. And then like I don't talk to my kids about it that much either. I mostly like let other people bring that up if they want
Sure.
to. Don't you bring that up yourself?
Yeah.
But it does seem like, I don't know, it would have been a lot of fun to be a kid in that house. And I sort of aspire to make my family life kind of like that, like
Yeah.
fun, a little crazy.
Yeah, he would take them on these like walks, I read. So they'd go on these long walks, and he would try to like walk them through a rushing river or over like a pile of rock. It was about these, Theodore Roosevelt would do these kind of like nature walks / American Ninja Warrior practice to
Right.
make like tough, resilient, active kids.
Yeah. Which I think is like the best way to do it. I mean, you can learn a lot of virtues, I think, through physical activity and physical challenge.
Yes. And certainly not learn some things by not doing or learn the wrong lessons by not experiencing challenges or shying away from challenges or having things come easily or without struggle.
Yeah. I think that the experience of struggling and achieving something
Yeah.
is really great. And the experience of struggling and failing and realizing that that doesn't destroy you is equally important.
And I imagine in Theodore Roosevelt's time with his family, with his parents, they were probably quite concerned about raising indolent, spoiled, fragile children because didn't have to work, had immense resources. You know what I mean? I mean, there's the famous story, right? Like he has asthma and he's sort of weak,
Yeah.
and his father says, "You're smart, but like you have a weak body and you got to make your body." And you can see the gym at the house on, was it 21st Street, 19th Street?
Yeah.
Like the strenuous life that Theodore Roosevelt was sort of introduced to is a reaction, deliberately so, I think, from his parents to the comfort and the potential entitlement that could come from that comfort.
Yeah. Which I think was exactly the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I do parkour with my kids.
Really?
Yes. My coach Patrick is a fan of this podcast.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And we started out and we were at this gym and they're like, the first thing we teach you is how to fail. And I was like, that's really good. Learn how to fail safely, right?
Yeah.
And then you fail safely, you build on that.
Like how to not hurt yourself
succeed.
falling.
Yeah. Like the first thing you do before you try to actually land the move
Sure.
is you think about, I'm going to do this, I'm not going to make it, what happens next?
Mm-hmm.
And then how can I do that safely? And parkour, I mean, the thing that impresses me the most about it is it always shows me that I'm capable of more than I thought.
Mm-hmm.
So usually like each class, there's some thing that we're building up to.
Mm-hmm.
And, you practice the different components and then you try to put them all together, and it's a lot harder to put it all together than do them individually. But I almost always end up doing things where at the beginning of the class, I was like, there's no way I can do that.
It's also an interesting hobby or sport, I guess, in the sense that, I mean, it's you against yourself, or it's you against your physical limitations, but primarily you against your sense of against your fears.
It's primarily mental.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm more scared than I need to be is the thing that I learned from a lot of it.
And the muscle.
Occasionally I've hurt myself,
but
never that badly.
But building the muscle of being able to do something that you're afraid to do is pretty great.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really useful. And also it feels incredible. You're like, wow, I didn't believe I could do that, but then I did.
Well, that's the letter I was telling you about. Why I was so struck by it. I wrote about it in my Courage book. Is basically he thinks he wants to meet Booker T. Washington. Theodore Roosevelt wants to meet Booker T. Washington, and he's like, I'll invite him to the White House. And for this split second, he thinks about what a shitstorm is going to result from doing that, and then he decides to do it because of that feeling, and that can't be the first time that he did that. Right? That's a muscle.
Right.
Like the first time you do that is not when you are president, touching the third rail of American politics at that time, which is race, right? That is the hunting trips and the boxing and the explorations and the mountain climbing and the publishing. It's his whole life was leading up to doing, as Emerson said, do the thing you're afraid to do.
Yeah.
You have to build, that's a muscle.
Yeah, totally.
And cultivating it, doing parkour, helps you when you're going to write a novel, which could feel like, I don't know about you, but when you put like some artistic thing out in the world, there's that, like, is this cringe? Is this weird?
It's scary. Oh, it's definitely.
Are people going to laugh at me?
Yeah. And like when you're writing, there are different choices you can make. And there's like the riskier one and the safer one.
Yeah.
And the one that sounds like everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes you do wonder if your vampire novel is going to make you look ridiculous.
Yes.
And I tell people about it and they sort of laugh, but I'm really going to do it.
Well, one of the things I do is I don't tell people about creative things I'm considering, because like when I tell you about the book idea that I have, it's obviously not the best explanation of that idea because I haven't done it yet, right? Like at the end, I can tell you exactly what the book is, but as it's, still a thing I'm figuring out, by definition, I'm not going to give a great explanation, right? It's like you can give the elevator pitch for Google after it's Google easier than you can when you're thinking about what Google is going to be. And so I would find that as I would tell people, hey, I'm thinking about quitting my job to write a book. Oh, really? What's the book about? There's no explanation I can give you of the book that's going to make you tell me that it sounds like I should definitely do that, right?
Yeah.
You're going to be like, oh, good for you. I hope it works out. And I'm going to pick up on your skepticism and it's going to make me self-conscious. So I basically don't tell people about stuff I'm working on until I'm basically done.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And actually, like, that's usually what I do.
Yeah.
It's been so long with the vampire novel, I kind of plotted it out mostly that I was telling people about it. But usually, yeah, I find that like the feedback I get when I'm in the early stages of a project tends to make me less confident about it.
So I might kind of float it around, but not tell you, or, like I might talk about the ideas, but not be like, I think I'm going to write a book about it. Yeah. But the awkwardness of the half-baked idea, a lot of things can get killed there. And you've got to have good people around you who are not that. Spouses can be great at this, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, it sounds amazing. It didn't, but they told you that because you needed to hear that. You know what I mean? I guess that's another tradition you've continued, the sort of writer, scholar, lawyer.
Yeah, well, I always wanted to write fiction. And then I got sort of more interested in nonfiction and politics and social issues, just sort of through the practice of teaching constitutional law, I guess, because it made me pay more attention to what was going on. And then I thought, in order to understand what's going on now, I need to understand where it came from. Mm-hmm. So I started trying to learn more history. But I love writing. I mean, I love pretty much every aspect of my job.
Yeah.
I sort of go back and forth between whether the writing is my favorite or the teaching is my favorite, but it's really sort of whatever I'm doing at the time.
And you've done, what, 3 books? You've done 2 novels, 1 nonfiction?
And also there's a book called The Myth of Judicial Activism, which is about Supreme Court decisions, sort of trying to decide whether the Supreme Court is abusing its power. So I wrote that in like 2005, back when the criticisms of the court were coming from the right. Mm-hmm. And people were like, this liberal activist court is doing these terrible things. And so I tried to come up with a perspective that would let you say something about whether the court was behaving appropriately, sort of what we want a Supreme Court in a constitutional democracy to do.
Yeah.
And so then like the test for that is, now that the criticisms of the court are coming more from the left, does what I said still make sense? And I think it does. I mean, I think it works out pretty well. Because my basic idea there was the court is one actor in our system of constitutional democracy, and other people are supposed to interpret the Constitution too, and sometimes maybe what they think is worthy of respect from the court. So other institutional actors like Congress can decide whether what they're doing is necessary to protect interstate commerce better than the court can.
Sure.
Probably. And often they can decide whether some group of people is being treated appropriately or not better than the court can, because it's just 9 people in Washington who are often out of touch. So there are some constitutional issues where it makes sense to defer to representative legislatures and so on. And then there are some where it doesn't, and you can sort of look at what's been going on historically and how good different institutional actors are at making certain kinds of decisions, and whether there are like defects in the political process that would make you not trust what's going on, depending on, who wins and who loses with a particular law or something. And it all kind of works pretty well, I think, to figure out like when the court should be asserting itself and stepping up and saying, we're going to decide this, and when they should be holding back and saying, we're going to leave this to ordinary politics.
Well, we were talking earlier about this idea of duty, like, this is my role, this is my job, I'm going to do that job come hell or high water. I think one of the things we're missing, there's a great Pericles quote where he goes like, a person can't abdicate their responsibility or their engagement without forcing the engagement upon someone else, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like a good chunk of the American problem, but maybe you could argue this sort of globally, is that when people who are in positions of leadership or something falls in their realm of responsibility, when they don't step up and do that job, it just defers it onto someone else. So the court has been forced to adjudicate a whole bunch of issues, and also not adjudicate, because that is their job. The court has been forced to decide a bunch of major political questions in the absence of a functioning Congress, right? Like,
yeah.
Or a functioning legislative branch. And because people aren't, in the same way that the president is getting stuck with the responsibility for what's happening at the border, as although that's not a legislative issue, right? So or the border agencies are being forced to deal with what's happening at the border because they're not giving good instructions from both the court and the president and Congress. So when one society or one institution doesn't do their job, it forces that pressure finds a different way to go. And
right.
that pressure is often not, that pressure breaks the institution that it's being redirected towards, because it's not made for that pressure
the
either.
institution's not made to do.
Yes.
Right. So the president's not supposed to be making laws.
Yes.
But when Congress doesn't act, the president does what he can through executive orders.
Yes.
And like same thing with the Supreme Court, I think. One of the things that people have complained about with some Supreme Court decisions is, it looks like legislation, because you're setting out this detailed code. That was one of the things that people objected to with Roe v. Wade. And it's true. If Congress did more, or if the political branches resolved conflict better, maybe we wouldn't be punting so many things to the court.
Yeah. Like, I think it's funny you have these certain congressmen and senators who are mad about woke businesses. Like, why are these businesses getting political? And it's like, to me, it's very obvious. It's because those businesses, which are made up of people, feel like the government is not being responsive to the problems that they have brought to their attention. That actually there's a broad consensus around a number of pressing issues, right? But because of our sort of janky system, you don't actually get any satisfying legislative or governmental solutions to those problems. So people go, if I can't get my congressperson, like, this is one of the most gerrymandered districts in the entire country right here, right? Mm-hmm. And so because I have no hope of reaching my congressman about anything, I might talk to my book publisher about something, or my boss about something, right? I might, where I have leverage as a person, I'm going to try to use that leverage, because everyone wants the world to be the way that they think it should be, or let's just be more generous. Everyone wants the world to be better. If they don't, if they cannot bring about political change through the system as it's intended to go, they go, I'm an employee at Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg, you're my boss. I'm going to quit if you don't do something about it, right?
Yeah.
And so it creates that it's directing that pressure into institutions that are not designed for that pressure and are not particularly able to express political viewpoints very effectively. And so it's by someone not doing their job, which is politicians, other people are doing double or triple duty, or stepping into things that are like, because we had such a woeful pandemic response, social networking companies found themselves having to make public health decisions. And now we're mad at them for making these public health decisions. It's like they were under a lot of pressure from customers, from employees, and ironically from government, as if government didn't have their own solutions to this problem.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think it's not so bad. You see this with climate change, where, if you can't get the action that you want from the government, maybe you can pressure businesses into doing the right thing. So sometimes it works.
But when people are like, why are these companies being so political? It's because politics isn't working.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think our political system, Congress in particular, is broken.
Yes. Well, why do we have the same number of representatives that we've had for so long?
Oh, we should definitely have more representatives.
Yeah.
We should have more states.
Of course.
We should have small blue states so that Senate malapportionment doesn't have a partisan tilt, because it really shouldn't have a partisan tilt. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. We should have ranked choice voting. Final five voting would be a great idea. So this idea is you have an open primary, and then the top five vote getters go on to the general election, and you have ranked choice voting with instant runoffs.
Yeah.
Because one of the reasons, I think maybe like the main reason that the political system works so badly is it's basically primary voters who determine the outcome, because you've got all of these safe districts. Mm-hmm. And the people who vote in the primary are the most intense partisans, and very often they're motivated by negative partisanship, which is they just think the other side is the enemy and wants to destroy me. So they elect this person, and then if that person is like, I'm going to reach across the aisle and work with the other party, they're like, you're a traitor, and they get rid of them.
Sure.
So obviously, like, you're electing people and then you're punishing them for actually doing something.
Right.
So you end up with this negative polarization in the government too, where people are really afraid to work with the other side.
Well, I think if you ask someone like Theodore Roosevelt, obviously he had his imperial streak, so he would have thought this for slightly different reasons. But I bet he would have been surprised at how little growth there has been in some of these institutions, in the sense that there are only marginally more states than when he was president, right? There haven't been some of those changes, I think the idea was never that you get to a point and then you cease to grow, and then everyone just fights over the same number of seats, or like a dynamic system is growing and expanding and changing, and
improving.
Otherwise, you get bogged down in some form of kind of trench warfare, where it's only with really big mistakes or really big buildups that you get kind of a breakthrough. But yeah, if Puerto Rico was a state, it would force both conservatives and Democrats to adjust.
Right. Puerto Rico would be an interesting state.
Of course.
Because it would be kind of up in the air.
Yes.
District of Columbia, that would also be a good state.
Yes.
I think. I mean, that's
that would
like
force a dynamism.
Taxation without representation.
Of course. And you would, instead of everything, all the lines being very established and only something like COVID shaking things a little bit, you would be having new changes that are happening all the time. I'm not saying you should be capturing Pacific Islands and making them into states, right? But like if California was suddenly 4 states.
Yes. If we've got 2 Dakotas, we should have 4 Californias.
Yes.
I usually say 3, but I'd go for 4 too.
Yeah.
And we should have a national popular vote, because that makes California matter, right? There's 3 million Republican votes in California, and they count for nothing with the Electoral College and the winner-take-all system. And no one cares about California. It's all about Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina. But if you have a national popular vote system, then every vote actually matters.
Sure.
And if you change someone's mind, that helps you, even if it's in New York or Texas or California.
Right.
Right. And you don't get the obsessive focus on changing people's minds in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it's like I grew up in California. I live in Texas. In both states, my vote doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because it's already decided.
Right.
It's effectively already decided.
Yeah. And the vote of someone in Wyoming counts like 3 times as much. as yours.
Yeah.
Which is an offense against our basic principle of political equality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if there is a founding American principle, I mean, there are a couple probably. One, I said before, is loyalty not to a person, but to an idea, loyalty to the Constitution, which is why the Trump flag is so bad. But political equality of citizens.
Yeah.
So at the founding, they're very big on this idea. There's no kings, there's no aristocracy. There are no superior insiders. They're okay with the inferior outsiders, which is the enslaved people.
Yeah.
But there is this idea that Americans, no American is better than any other American.
Sure.
And it's just wrong for some Americans' votes to count more, because that's basically an aristocracy. So right now we've got like this rural, low population aristocracy, and you get minority rule from that.
But don't you think also the meta sort of lesson of America or meta story of America is also that change is possible? So America founded by change, right? It's like break off, and then you have this revolution. You have this new system of government that's never existed. And then you have the Articles of Confederation, which are a disaster. And they go, this is a disaster. Let's change it. They change it and then go, oh shit, we missed a bunch of important things. We're going to amend it with 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And then, by the way, we're going to continue to add to the Bill of Rights. We're going to make alcohol illegal. And then we're going to realize that was a huge mistake. And just a couple amendments later, change it. And then at some point, like 1970, we were like, no more. Everything is this, nothing changes. Same number of representatives effectively.
Right.
Same, it's impossible to add to the Constitution. And now everything's the same. So you get bogged down. And so I think there is this sense for now more than a generation where we don't have agency over the governmental system, that it simply is what it is. You can't change it. It won't be radically different in your children's lifetime than it was in your lifetime. And there's something very sad about that.
Yeah, and the end of the amendments is just about the rise of originalism. It's like the same time period. And we were talking about this before, and I think there's actually something to that, because it's the rise of originalism that makes us think of the founding moment as a concrete moment when everything is fixed.
Yes.
And all of the answers are there. And then we're sort of building out and trying to live up to the ideals and more fully realize them and so on, but it's all there at the founding.
Right.
And in fact, the historical understanding at the time was it was fluid.
Yeah.
Things were changing. And maybe the biggest lie that we tell ourselves about the American story, I think, is that it's this sort of steady progress of fuller realization of founding ideals.
Yeah.
That the essence of America is there in 1776. Whereas really, like the story that you were telling is it's failure and reinvention.
Yeah.
And we work within the system that we have for as long as we can, as long as we think it's going to get us where we need to go. And then at a certain point, again and again, we realize this isn't going to take us where we need to go. We have to break it and start something new. And that's like the story of the Revolution, and it's the story of the failure of the Articles of Confederation, and it's the story of the Civil War and Reconstruction too. I mean, first, the South is like, the system's not working anymore, we're leaving.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the country's like, no, you're not.
Yeah, we paid for all that stuff.
Yeah, right, give us back our forts.
Yeah.
But then, like Reconstruction, they're trying to work within the system, and the 13th Amendment is enacted through the normal process. And then they can't get the 14th Amendment ratified. And that's when the Reconstruction Congress is like, okay, we're destroying the original states. We're going to break this and move forward. So we get these moments of radical reinvention, and those are really often the moments of progress. So like one of the lessons that I think we should take from American history that we downplay is that very often it's conflict that leads to progress.
And maybe one thing I would add to that I think is both hopeful and then maybe something that's missing is that work was primarily done by young people. The founders are remarkably young.
Yeah.
You know, they're all kind of under 40 for the most part. Benjamin Franklin's like the lone old guy. Obviously, the civil rights movement, we see it as Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, both of whom were essential, but we forget that it's really the students in Nashville and the sit-in movement, the kids who are putting their bodies on the line that actually transform it into this. You know, it's the freedom riders that make it from an issue that's affecting the people in Montgomery to a federal issue that draws the North in and really brings about the change. And so, the idea that this isn't like old people kind of fiddling around with things at the margins, but it's also young generations going, hey, you guys have screwed it up in some cases, or you guys have taken this as far as you're willing to take it, and we're going to pick up the torch now. I'm writing about this, and I think this is historically true. I write about Thomas Clarkson, the British abolitionist. Mm-hmm. He writes a college essay about this question of whether it's wrong or right to own a human being. And he wins this prize, and he's riding his horse away from Oxford. And he's won the essay, but he was just writing what he thought they wanted to hear to win. Like, he wrote not even what they wanted to hear. He tried to write what he didn't think anyone else would write. And that's what wins. He writes that, no, you can't own a human being. And as he's riding away, Adam Hochschild writes about this in Bury the Chains, but he has this sort of road to Damascus moment. He's on the road and he goes, if I'm right, someone should do something about this. And then he goes, that person could be me.
Yeah.
And one man eliminates essentially the oldest institution in human history, from a college essay. And that is a remarkable but then timeless thing right there. That's what those college students, those vets who came home from World War II were like, I don't want to ride on the back of the bus. I don't want to be pushed around. Like, I want to go eat a sandwich with my friends, and I'm going to do something about it. The idea that young people can demand that the system change and then remake the system in their image kind of stopped with the baby boomers.
Yeah, I mean, you do see young people doing that now, like organizing around climate change, organizing around gun violence. I hope it's going to work.
I hope so. I hope it's not too late. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's but this generation is up against so much entrenched sort of, there's not room because a lot of the offices haven't been vacated.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it. I don't think the lifetime appointments idea ever anticipated people living to be 100 years old.
No, it also didn't anticipate the party system. So
Sure.
if we're talking about lifetime appointments for federal judges and the Supreme Court in particular, that's terrible. That's completely broken. It's completely messing up our system of governance now, because the way things are now, justices retire strategically so that the president who appoints their successor is going to appoint someone like them. They're sort of replacing themselves. And what that means is the current composition of the Supreme Court can persist pretty much indefinitely,
barring
as long
a random
as
accident.
Yeah, as long as the Republicans win 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 elections, because you wait 12 years, then 4 justices retire, you replace them with young people, you keep that majority forever. And that's not the way it was supposed to work.
Yeah, stasis is not natural. It's supposed to be change and dynamism. And
I mean, more generally, I think we're seeing some problems with how old some of our political leaders are, and it would be better if we had younger political leaders.
Yeah.
But life tenure on the Supreme Court is like a particular structural problem. It could be fixed. The proposals are out there, like 18-year term limits. Let each president appoint 2 justices per 4-year term. We could really do that.
We could do that.
We could do that, yes.
But
I'd like to see more action on it.
There's the belief that we could do that.
Well, it's weird. It's weird because it seems like political actors don't think that we can, even though there's broad bipartisan popular support for it. And yet people are acting like, no, it's not possible. We can't do that.
Yeah, as if
I don't know why not.
Yeah, it's as if it was supposed to stay the same forever.
Yeah, well, so there's this idea that changing the Constitution is like unwise or unpatriotic or something like that, which is crazy because 1, like the Constitution provides for a method of amendment, and then 2, like the things that we like the best about the Constitution are basically the amendments, right? No one's like, I feel a swell of American pride when I recall that the president has to be a natural born citizen.
Right.
They're like, I feel a swell of pride when I think about life, liberty, and property being protected by the Due Process Clause, which is the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment. I think that our protection of free speech is so great, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Like, it's kind of been applied in a funny way sometimes, but that's an amendment. Like, we love the amendments.
Well, last question, actually, because which you would be, as a constitutional scholar, you'd be the expert. There was this sense, right? Franklin Roosevelt tries to, or proposes packing the court, and there's this sort of rebellion against it, right? Like, the story we tell ourselves is like the people and Congress were horrified, and he backs off. As I understand it, it's like his vice president was very opposed, a Southerner. How much of it was actually an understanding in the Democratic coalition, which at that point included all the Southern Democrats, that if he fucks with the composition of the court, our tenuous hold on the levers of power, that's like that like FDR's mistake was thinking, hey, I'm going to pack the court so I can get some of these social safety net programs through. And the actual reaction was, you're threatening this whole segregation thing.
I don't know, actually. I haven't really heard that.
I just made it up.
It's possible.
But do you know what I mean? Like, I was thinking,
but the other thing about the court packing plan is, no, he didn't end up packing the court, but also the court kind of changed its tack.
Yes.
So, it's not entirely clear that he didn't get most of what he wanted.
Right. But there was this kind of arrangement in the Democratic Party that, like, I mean, Kennedy ironically puts in a bunch of the judges who are most resistant to his civil rights program, because he's rewarding, it's political patronage. He's like, I'll give you the judges you want. So there was this kind of schizophrenic, division in the party where, yeah, sure, we all agree we should have these social safety net things, but if you put a bunch of Northerners on the Supreme Court or a bunch of more modern liberals on the Supreme Court, how long is our ability to continue to interpret the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment the way we are? How long is that going to last? And does suddenly the whole legal edifice of the South become vulnerable?
Maybe, yeah. I don't know. I mean, the thing that did happen was you got the social programs and the social safety nets, and then they were applied in a racially discriminatory way.
A compromise.
Kind of, it is a compromise, yeah. Like, people are against redistribution, but it's okay if it ends up really only going to white people.
Sure.
It's like redistribution that increases racial equality. That's like the third rail.
But it is interesting how much change or not change a human life can progress through. Like, I was just reading about this guy. You might have heard of him. You know who Thomas Wentworth Higginson is? He was a Harvard grad. No. He's kind of this underrated historical figure. So he comes from this wealthy Boston family or Cambridge family. And he's a translator of Epictetus. And he becomes pen pals with this lady named Emily Dickinson. He leads a black regiment of troops in the U.S. Civil War. And so he signs one of the first calls for a national women's convention for women's rights. Again, like, women's rights, abolition, we don't see as happening at roughly the same time, but they do, right? And then I was reading about him, so I was like, wow, this is an incredible life. There's this philosopher who's also engaged in the main issues of the day. And then I go, well, when did he die? And then I'm reading this thing, and he's like, he was part of a literary conference with Jack London and Upton Sinclair before he died in 1911.
Yeah.
And so the idea that he's stretching from, like, before the Civil War, when they're deciding, when it's an actual discussion about whether black people should have rights or whether women should have rights, and then flash forward to the early to mid the early 1900s, when, like, there's machines and, like, these modern figures are also around. it just kind of blows your mind how much happened in that period and how much these questions were being still debated.
Yeah. And the same questions keep being debated. That's the other thing. Like, one thing about the book is how much our understandings of certain things like the Declaration of Independence changed. And then the other thing that I was really struck by writing it was how much sort of echo there is. And it is almost, so like fashion sort of moves in 30-year cycles. American history kind of moves in 100-year cycles.
Okay.
It looks like, and we've had like 3 of them.
Yeah. I have it here. I have a Theodore Roosevelt quote you might like that I thought of when I was reading the book, which I like to post every 4th of July. He said, "In name, we had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but we gave lie by our acts to the words of the Declaration of Independence until 1865, and words count for nothing insofar as they represent acts."
That's very Stoic.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Acta non verba, deeds not words. Yeah. And so, we had this sort of story, and actually the ongoing debate is like, we've always had this story, we've always had these ideals, and then it's this sort of generational conflict or argument about whether we're going to live up to them or not, or how they apply or not. Like, I thought that's one of the interesting things in the book, that like that all men are created equal. You have a good chunk of the United States in the early days who believe that means that slave owners should not be discriminated against.
Yeah. Right. So the principle of equality can mean lots of different things to different people. And like, that's one of the concepts that you see sort of floating around in this indeterminate way at the founding, and then it's just fought over.
Yeah.
People just argue for their perspective, and actually eventually it does come to military force.
Yes. Well, and then even in the Roosevelt era, there's like these sort of Supreme Court arguments where like basically the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which seem like they're pretty fucking clear, are being used actually for the opposite of what they're intended to mean. That basically it's sort of protecting sort of moneyed interests and protecting basically everyone but the individuals from exercising those equal rights and access to things, which isn't sort of, you'd think like that's just obviously not what they're intended to mean. And yet, when it makes its way into the courtroom, so kind of like what's up is down and down is up, and somehow they manage to make successful, in the sense that they work, successful arguments that actually, no, it wasn't intended to do this thing that it was obviously intended to do.
Yeah, and actually that's something that you see with a lot of different constitutional provisions. And it was sort of amazing to me teaching constitutional law year after year, where I would get to these cases and I was like, geez, that's really not what this was supposed to be doing. Like, the First Amendment is not supposed to protect the rights of corporations to drown out the individual speaker.
Yes.
That seems kind of contrary to the purpose.
Yeah.
The 14th Amendment is not supposed to prevent the government from trying to increase racial equality.
Yeah.
That's kind of the opposite.
Yeah.
But the explanation for all of that is pretty simple, which is that like power takes over. And so you put in constitutional provisions that are supposed to protect politically weak groups, and the powerful capture them and use them for their own purposes. And it's just sort of a phenomenon about how power operates in society, I think.
I think that's an underrated or an understood part of American history, or the story I have come to understand about American history is that we sort of get these democratic institutions, we get this system, and then basically what happens through some stuff that was very clearly spelled out at the beginning, whether we're talking about the 3/5 clause, whatever, is it's basically captured by this sort of slave-holding aristocracy or oligarchy that basically just controls the lever of power for the government for most of American history. And it's only been kind of in these punctuated periods where that hold is lessened that you get some of the breakthroughs, but that's basically how it's worked.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is, I think that's by design.
Oh.
So, what is the point of the 3/5 compromise? What does it do? What does everyone understand at the time it's going to do? It tilts the whole national government in favor of slavery.
Yeah.
Because you've got the House of Representatives. Obviously, the 3/5 compromise gives the slave states more representatives. And then because a state's number of electors is determined in part by its number of representatives, they get more voice in picking the president. And then because the president nominates judges, they get more voice in the composition of the judiciary. And that's why for the first 70 or 80 years of its existence, America is controlled by the slave power, basically.
Right. Yeah, interesting. And then that sort of changed my understanding of Jim Crow too, which is like, it's not that they just invent this idea of segregation, even like obviously it's racially motivated. Obviously it's a sort of a status quo where blacks and whites are supposed to be separate, don't want mixing of the races, et cetera. But that if you understand that at a deeper level, it's just a reversion to the status quo that was the 3/5 compromise. It makes a lot of like basically the Civil War blows apart the hold, the illegitimate hold that these people have in the levers of power, because they're, for the first time, you have an actual form of representative government, right? Where like it's not artificially skewed by not counting certain populations. Now they're like, well, we'll count these populations again, but we just won't let them vote through fear of intimidation and reprisals and, poll taxes and all these other complicated things. It's just this sort of it's trying to get back to this thing that I guess goes back to the very founding, which is you have a good chunk of the colonies who are like, we don't want to be a part of it unless we get to do it our way. And almost like in a lopsided marriage where you just have to sort of accept this fundamentally unfair status quo or the other person leaves.
Yeah, so the Civil War and Reconstruction are this incredible break in American history that I think we downplay.
Yeah.
And we downplay it in part because we gave up. Mm-hmm. So with the Civil War, there's like the military defeat of the South. With Reconstruction, there's a fundamental restructuring of the American constitutional order because all of a sudden the federal government is the good guys.
Yeah.
Right. At the founding, the founders are thinking about the state militias fighting off the redcoats. They're thinking the national government is dangerous. The states are the protectors of liberty. And Reconstruction basically turns that upside down because the national government is the force for liberty. The states are the bad guys. And politically, they change it too because the 3/5 compromise has been superseded. And now you've got, the former Confederates being barred from office with Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And Congress actually, during Reconstruction, they send out the 14th Amendment to be ratified. And this is something that I was never taught this in school. I don't know how it's taught now. But they send out the 14th Amendment to be ratified, and it gets rejected.
Oh.
10 of the 11 former Confederate states reject it. Tennessee ratifies. And then also like Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky. So if you think of sort of founding America, they reject the 14th Amendment, and Congress then annihilates 10 of the former Confederate states, the ones that said no. Congress says your governments are dissolved. No governments exist in these states. And then they basically make new states. So they say, here's who your political community is, right? You don't get to define yourself the way the Declaration of Independence talks about as like one people wanting to govern themselves. We're going to tell you the formerly enslaved are citizens. And we're going to tell you who gets to vote too, because now you're going to have constitutional conventions. You're going to write new constitutions. The formerly enslaved get to participate in those. The former Confederates don't. So Congress is basically making new states. And it's the new states that ratify the 14th Amendment. That gives us, in my view, like basically a new American nation.
Yes.
Very different founding principles. But the problem is the former Confederates don't accept that.
Yes.
So the U.S. Army has to fight basically a counterinsurgency war to support the racially integrated Reconstruction governments and eventually the will of white America to maintain this counterinsurgency campaign fades away. And that's when the federal troops withdraw, and that's when Reconstruction is overthrown. And again, we don't teach this very well, I think, but it's by violence.
Have you read, it's a novel from around that period, it's called The Fool's Errand?
No, I haven't read that.
It was written by Albion, I'm forgetting his name. There's a lawyer named Albion, I should look it up actually. He's let me get this. Albion Torge? I don't know.
Oh,
he's one of Theodore Roosevelt's friends.
Right.
He's the, I write about this in Courageous Calling, but there's this famous letter between him and Theodore Roosevelt where Theodore Roosevelt is explaining why he invited Booker T. Washington to dine with him at the White House. And he says, I know it's going to kill me in the southern states, but the fact that I considered that it would kill me in the southern states is why I did it. Like, he's like, I didn't want to be the person that didn't want to do what's obviously the right thing for political reasons. But he writes this novel called The Fool's Errand, which is loosely based on his experience in that he's a officer in the Union. The war goes well, but he fights in the South. He kind of falls in love with it. And he moves to Alabama or something. The plot of the novel is he moves to Alabama. And he's just going to be an American in Alabama because this is all the United States. Mm-hmm. And he sort of quickly discovers that that's not how it is. And that the people who just waged this horrendous war, their minds didn't change because they were beaten on the battlefield. And he sort of discovers that also it wasn't even that they'd sort of rationally gotten to think what they had thought, but that there was this whole reinforcing structure that had existed that made it impossible to question, like that there were all these laws in place and a culture of intimidation that said, hey, if you question any of these institutions, we'll lynch you, we'll intimidate you, we'll destroy everything you have. And so he describes it as this fool's errand, thinking that you could go into the South during Reconstruction and reconstruct it, right? He basically bumps into the unreconstructed South, for which his basic conclusion was like, there isn't an army big enough in the world to sort of to occupy and change these people's minds. I found it to be it's this interesting sort of contemporaneous documentation of what must have been a lot of the feelings that led into the abandonment of Reconstruction in the way that like an equivalent today might be like, you and I don't feel as strongly about vaccines as the people who are anti-vaccine. And so at a certain point where it's like, let's just go on and live our lives. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like when you bump up into something that is so fundamentally irrational and deeply held and based on all these different factors, I think you do notice that sort of collapse in collective will. It's hard for a big tent of people to get together and stay activated around an issue for a long period of time when you're coming up against a deeply entrenched sort of minority, but what would you call it? Like a sort of veto style power. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, so this is another one of the problems with the democratic system is that yes. Like the passionate minority tends yes. to get its way.
Yeah, because you can just hold out until eventually the other side gives up or compromises to some degree.
Yeah. And also because in a lot of these situations, the passionate minority is willing to wreck everything.
Yes.
If they don't get their way. So there are several moments in American history where some Americans are like, we must all come together or the nation will be destroyed.
Yeah.
The nation will fail. So the revolution is a moment like that. The Constitution is a moment like that. And then there are some people who are like, fine, but if we don't get what we want, then there will be no America.
Right.
And historically, that's the slave owners.
Yes.
And they're demanding concessions to slavery, and basically they get them every time.
Right. To go back to that divorce analogy, because you're like, well, I don't want to break up, and you are willing to break up, and so you have all the power.
Yeah. And then that's what happens exactly like with the end of Reconstruction.
Yes.
Because the white Americans in the North are not willing to keep fighting, and the white Americans in the South are willing to keep fighting. And
yes.
so eventually you get the compromise of 1877.
And isn't this also, like, understanding that has helped me understand the playbook of the civil rights movement, in that the South was like, well, let's just try that again. Right? So the North basically leaves the South alone for like 80 or 100 years. And, this whole sort of reversion to the old mean comes about, and different name, different practices, but the South still essentially has the same power, the same veto power over any kind of change that would disrupt the status quo. They sort of have the representation as if their population was X, but they only have to speak for, 50% of X, right?
Yeah.
And so when the North gets nosy again and says, hey, we don't really like that you can't do this, and we're going to send people on buses from the North to the South, and we're going to say, schools have to be desegregated. We're gonna mandate on a federal level just certain ideas of equality and justice. The South says to itself, and then also to the North, what if we just make that so difficult again that your will collapses? And it very well could have happened that way. Like it seems, because it didn't go that way, it seems like they were sort of fighting against the inevitable tide of history, but it had worked literally every time up until that point.
Yeah, and I mean, it did and it didn't work that time, because yes, we get the Voting Rights Act, we get integration, we get the 101st Airborne in Little Rock enforcing the desegregation decree. But we had all that in Reconstruction, right? We had the U.S. Army there enforcing people's civil rights. We had racially integrated governments. We had racially integrated schools and police forces. We had real multiracial democracy in the South, and then we lost it. And we had the second Reconstruction, right? Yeah. That's what people call the civil rights movement. And we had integration, and we had the Voting Rights Act, and then there was opposition to it. And, Ronald Reagan in 1980, starting his campaign, says that he believes in states' rights, and he's going to appoint Supreme Court justices who will follow the original understanding. And if you're thinking, okay, states' rights, original understanding, where is he giving that speech? Philadelphia. You're like, okay, it's about the founding. But he's talking in Philadelphia, Mississippi, not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Sure.
States' rights has a slightly different flavor there. So what you get with the Reagan Revolution and the idea of originalism and the new federalism, which is about states' rights, is presented as sort of a return to founding principles. And everyone's like, oh, that's not bad because we all love the founding. 1776 is great. But what it's doing is rolling back the second Reconstruction, really. And the point of rolling back the first Reconstruction wasn't really to go back to the founding, it was to go back to the Confederacy.
Yes.
So the really important question, I think, is when we're looking at the values that are being put forward in the name of the founding, are we actually really getting neo-Confederate values? And with the Reagan Revolution, I think that's kind of the direction that we were moving in. And now, like if you look at what the Supreme Court has done recently, Shelby County, gutting the Voting Rights Act, that's very much the redemption playbook, right? That's the undoing of Reconstruction. That's the undoing of multiracial democracy.
So I've kind of been working on this theory, which is there's this kind of like dark matter inside the human race, this sort of dark energy that it seems like we sort of slay, whether it's with the founding, whether it's with these compromises, whether it's with the Civil War, whether it's with the Civil Rights Movement. And then there does this idea of trying to revert, trying to go back, to redeem, seems to be, it's this sort of yin and yang, right? What is the motivating factor of it, right? Like the slave power ceases to be the slave power exactly, right? It morphs into a different set of policy, and you could argue they're kind of weakening a little bit, right? Because we don't literally want to abandon them, but we do want to keep them as a cheap source of labor, or it's right. It's not there isn't. DeSantis isn't George Wallace, right? But there is this kind of energy that doesn't seem to go anywhere, but that people know is there, and certain politicians, certain interests, certain writers, certain filmmakers, right? If you're talking about Birth of a Nation, like there's always this sense that it's there, and it's very powerful, very volatile, but you can tap into it if you want. What is that?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a psychological question. Where does that come from? I think that...
And why is it so persistent?
Well, it's got to have some sort of hardwired basis in the human brain, I would think. So people do understand in-group and out-group pretty easily. And you can make them fear people that you designate as the out-group.
Sure.
So, a lot of politics works that way,
Yeah.
where they're saying, if you don't vote for me, these other people are going to come and get you,
Yeah.
right? They're going to take your
Sure.
job or they're going to kill you.
Somebody has to be the person getting fucked, basically.
Yeah. Well, I think
the
so.
primal belief, and someone saying, "Oh, fuck those people," so they don't
Right.
fuck you.
And you better make sure it's not you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you look at American history, like equality,
Yeah.
which we like to think of as this unifying American value, equality is the really divisive thing.
Yeah.
Because equality typically requires the dismantling of hierarchy, and people don't like that.
Right.
So they resist it.
Right. If the society is like this, you would think, well, who would mind this?
Right.
But it's actually more like this, and so a lot of people are opposed to it.
Yeah, a lot of people are opposed to it. A lot of people are told that they should fear it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if you give these people power, they're going to do terrible things to you.
Right. The only other kind of similar dark matter, like anti-Semitism seems to be an equally persistent, probably longer, like more global phenomenon where it's like there are periods where we're not doing it, and then
Right.
somebody's like, you know what, we haven't dusted off in a while, but could really get the people going. And then it kind of starts with these illusions, and then it gets more and more overt until, it gets so intolerable that you get a broad enough coalition to do something about fighting it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. Well, so anti-Semitism, I think there is kind of a psychological explanation for that makes sense because it's the kind of thing that people tend to believe.
Yeah.
So it's useful from an evolutionary perspective to see patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can put things together, you can figure out, what the rustle in the bushes means, or you can figure out what someone else is trying to do and what their plans are. So people have this agency detector that looks at a pattern of events and is like, something is behind that, something's making that happening.
Yeah.
Because if you're right about that, then you figured out something useful.
Sure.
But it's a little bit overactive, maybe, and it makes people see patterns where they aren't actually there. And it makes them attribute agency to things that are just sort of random. And so people are very willing to believe that there's some group out there causing all these things. There's some group out there pulling the strings.
Sure.
And that's kind of the form that anti-Semitism takes. So it fits very naturally into people's minds,
Yeah.
I think. Not that it's necessarily the Jews, but that there's some group there. It's the Illuminati,
Sure.
the Freemasons, and anti-Semitism just fits into that slot. And I think it's a way that people naturally think.
And don't you think it's also, like going back to the Greeks and Romans, the demagogue figure, the sort of populist speaker, the one who needs to come to power but is sort of not part of, I don't want to call it the elites, but is not sort of ordinarily endowed. They're needing to create a new constituency to control power. They tend to rely on those tricks. It's a very activating, sort of persuasive tool that people have been doing for thousands of years. Whether they're talking about anti-Semitism or racism in the United States, it's this way to get power. Like I'm rereading Robert Penn Warren's Kingfish right now. All the Kingsmen. And obviously I read it maybe 10 years ago when I lived in New Orleans, and I'm reading it now, and it's just like, it's remarkable how, this is just politics today. Like he's talking about newspapers and, rallies, and today we're talking about social media and rallies, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, and it puts me very strongly in mind of Trump, actually, when Trump is like, I am your vengeance.
Yes.
And in All the King's Men, he's like, give me that meat axe and I will swing it for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's sort of a terrifying moment, I think.
And not wrong. I mean, there's this line in the book where Jack, who's this sort of person who should know better, the enabler political advisor, he's like sort of talking to all his rich friends from back home, and he says something like, how could you do this, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, it's just a job. But don't you think if our government had been serving the people instead of its own interests for basically the entire U.S. history, there would not be an opportunity for a person like this. And you go, that's true, right? Like that is true. And there's an argument you can make as you're trying to understand how someone like Trump is possible. It explains it. And then at the same time, you realize that that's the rationalization that people who want to ride that rocket ship tell themselves, even though they should know better.
Yeah, I mean, people are always willing to hear that they're being lied to and they're being ripped off and they deserve better and really they should be better off than they are. And sometimes it's true, but, you know, you're not going to have a perfect government. Mm-hmm. People are always going to be dissatisfied. And then, you know, weaponizing that dissatisfaction and then particularly turning it on scapegoats and vulnerable groups, like that's a really bad thing.
Of course. But it's always possible. And there's not really anything in the system that prevents people from doing that. So that's kind of the other big hole in our system, which is basically the founders, maybe they were too reliant on the idea of classical virtue. It was this idea, it's this sort of idea that like, well, and we'll just hope or expect. I mean, there is the idea that ambition checks ambition, but there was this sense that there was things you could do, but a man or woman of honor simply would not do. And I think one of the things that we've learned over the last couple hundred years is like, no, they'll definitely do it. Someone will do it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why the framers were so wary of democracy. Mm-hmm. You know, and the 1787 Constitution is really not that democratic.
Yeah.
It's sort of as democratic as the states want to be to some extent. You know, in the election of representatives, you can vote for a federal representative if you're allowed to vote for the most numerous house of the state legislature. Otherwise, people get no direct voice under the 1787 Constitution. And you can look at like the Federalist Papers and what they say about the presidency and the Electoral College, because there they are concerned about what if a demagogue becomes president?
Sure,
because you're creating a chief executive office who's going to have a lot of power. It would be terrible if a bad person got into that position. And that's what the Electoral College is supposed to prevent. And you can read all of the things that Hamilton is saying in the Federalist Papers about how it's impossible that we'll ever get a bad president because the electors will be so wise and virtuous and they'll exercise their discretion, and a demagogue could maybe fool the people of one state but never a broad enough swath of the country to gain power. I don't know, it's all just sort of sad looking back how naive it was.
Yes, it was. You're right. There was this sense, I think, that the final check in all these different things was a person's personal sense of honor or reputation, right? And like pretty early on, they had a sense that that wasn't going to work when you look at like an Aaron Burr like figure.
Yeah, Burr, exactly.
But yeah, it was remarkably vulnerable to just someone without a sense of shame.
Yeah, and I think there was a kind of classism in that also, in that they thought, you know, the common people might be fooled, the common people might not be virtuous, but we've got some sort of elite buffer, right?
Yes.
That's what the Electoral College was supposed to be, that the elites will protect us because they have discernment and good values.
Yeah, and that they'd all read the same books and believed the same things and had the same values. And as the country grew and grew and grew, it's no longer like 20 people. You know what I mean? Like it becomes so much more vulnerable to individual. Like, I mean, I think when you look at 2020, it's not just that it comes down to like a handful of votes in some key states, but that beyond that, when someone decides not to accept those results, it comes down to like 3 or 4 people who decide not to go along with it. You know, whether it's, you know, a secretary of state in one state, or, you know, like just certain people, just 1 or 2 people who are like, you know, it's like someone in Michigan on some elections board doesn't vote the way that they think he's going to vote, and someone in Georgia. It's like, it's just a handful of consciences, not this incredibly robust, you know, series of interlocking checks and balances, but like more like exceptions than the rules.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. So when we look back on that and we're like, oh, the system held, democracy survived, it is true. It was really close.
Yeah.
And one of the things that people are doing in reaction to that is they were purging election officials who they thought wouldn't go along with it in 2024. And some of that was stopped in the 2022 elections because the Trump-supported candidates didn't do as well as people thought they would. But you don't have to replace a lot of people for it to work.
Yes. Yeah, there's this quote, I'm forgetting who it's from, but he says something like, the duty of a person is to act as if the fate of the world is on their shoulders, right? Which is this kind of ancient, it's somewhat grandiose, but it's also this kind of ancient idea that like who you are matters, your sort of personal sense of honor and duty, your job, these things really matter. And you can see where people who are acting that way end up stopping terrible things from happening. And then you see the converse being true also, where the person who says, well, I should just do what's in my interest here, or I don't want to be the one that takes the heat. You can see how people making individual decisions to just go along with what they're being asked to do sort of has the effect of putting the responsibility onto someone else and not themselves. Does that make sense? Like this idea that you enter politics or you enter public life or you enter a profession, whether it's the law or medicine or journalism, because you have this code that you live by, or you operate in business as though you are a fiduciary. These are like kind of principles that really, they seem antiquated until you get in these sort of high stakes, situations where person not acting that way shows you why you really need people to be steeped in those ideas from an early age.
Yeah, and this is something that the legal profession has been asking itself.
Yes.
I think, because you sort of expect politicians to behave in a self-interested way, and politicians don't necessarily have a loyalty to some external code, but the lawyers are supposed to. So, you look at Trump's adventures through the legal system in challenging the 2020 election, and mostly the judges did a pretty good job. So we feel like the judges have been socialized appropriately. I don't think that the Supreme Court justices that Trump appointed feel a personal loyalty to him. I think, they're pretty mainstream conservative rule of law kind of people. But there were a lot of lawyers who went along with Trump. There were a lot of lawyers who were trying to help him, and pretty high prestige lawyers. So something went wrong with the legal profession there. Like there were people who were willing to abandon the rule of law and truth and democracy for something.
What is that? Because I think it's a societal issue. I don't think it's just a political Trump issue. It's a sort of collapse of a sense of I got into this for a reason. These are that I can't. There's not many lines of work left where someone would say, I swore an oath unironically, and it would mean something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, that's what the whole Section 3 of the 14th Amendment litigation is about now. Like you took an oath to support the Constitution, and then you engaged in insurrection.
Yes.
And that should have consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I used to tell my law students that one way of understanding what my whole constitutional law course was about was when you're sworn into the bar, you're going to take this oath to support the Constitution. What does that mean?
Yeah.
What are you pledging your support to?
Yes.
And what does it mean to support it?
Yeah. And maybe it's partly a collapse of religion, like even the swearing of an oath on a Bible had some sort of significance to people that maybe is slightly lessened. But there's almost like it feels like to go like, I swore an oath, I said I was going to do this thing or not do this thing. And therefore to do it and blow up my career seems silly or immature, or do you know what I mean? Like there's it almost seems more than old fashioned. It seems immature or silly. This idea of like, this is my code and I have to follow it.
Yeah.
Come hell or high water.
Yeah, I think it's sort of related to the death of expertise, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
There's a collapse in the whole idea of things external to people that are real and matter,
Mm-hmm.
and things that can provide a scaffolding or a framework or a guide for your life in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it's like identifying with your profession as something that matters, right? Like whether you're like, I'm a bricklayer, and this is how a bricklayer operates, and this is what a bricklayer's work site looks like, and these are the standards that I hold myself to, all the way up to, yeah, I'm the president and I swore an oath. The idea of like taking that seriously and not cutting corners or accepting expediencies or the logic of expediency. Maybe I'm making up that it previously meant more, but it seems like it did.
Well, I think it did mean more. I mean, the problem that I have with this is that whenever you go back to the idealized past, you often find that it's based on hierarchy and oppression.
Yes. Or applied inconsistently.
Yeah. But I think it is true that a sort of professional pride or professional creed, or a belief that there's a right way to do things and it's important to do them the right way, would actually be really helpful.
Yeah. There's a story of Theodore Roosevelt I like. It was when he was in his sort of cowboy days. He's managing this herd, and these two cowboys come to him, and they've rounded up a couple cows that are clearly not his, and he tells them to let them loose and then fires them. They go, "Why are you firing us? We were going to give you like these free cows." And he says, if you steal from someone else, you'll steal from me. Right? This sort of sense of like, not only am I not going to benefit from it, but I'm not going to let you poison like the whole system. Like this whole thing operates on kind of an honor code. And that idea feels antiquated. I don't know who's teaching that idea and then who's enforcing it to the point where, or enforcing it early enough to the point where it becomes kind of a second nature. It becomes part of a person's identity.
I don't think that people are really. I mean, when I think about it, I had teachers, I had coaches growing up who did take that kind of attitude and tried to instill that set of values. And I don't see that as much in schools now.
Well, don't colleges have a huge problem with sort of academic honesty and cheating and?
Oh, yeah. I don't know how it compares to the past, but it's sort of routine now that you can't give students any opportunity to cheat because you know that some significant number will. So the system has to be sort of impossible to cheat. You can't rely on the honor of the students.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sad. And then also it creates a system where the response is you make the system harder and harder to cheat, as opposed to addressing it from the other end of the problem, which is raising or teaching people who don't cheat even when there's opportunities to cheat. Right?
Right.
But at a certain point, by the time it gets to the teacher or the professor or the dean, that pie is baked.
Yeah, by the time they're in college, it's too late.
Yeah. But it's hard, it's hard even to, obviously this is what everyone tells themselves when they're cheating, but when the whole system seems rigged and corrupt and not exactly pursuing, not exactly set up around virtue or values to begin with, this is where the human mind gets very good at saying, well, why shouldn't I get mine?
Right. And now we have lots of people telling us that the system is not fair.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is it's not, right? And it never was.
Yes.
So again, it's sort of going back to the idea that there was a time when there was a certain privileged class for whom things seemed sort of fair and it would work out if you play by the rules. And that probably did rely on the exploitation of other people.
Yes.
And so in some ways, it's good that people lose faith in the system. I don't know. I'm sort of going in circles here because, gosh, it would be great if everyone had these virtues and values that would get them to do the right thing independent of some external enforcement mechanism. But on the other hand, that usually relies on a hierarchical society, and that's why there isn't conflict. That's why there's stability, because you've got this stable hierarchy. And, so in some ways, I think it's good for people to question authority and distrust the system.
Yeah, I heard an interesting take on the marshmallow test, right, which is supposed to test your ability to delay gratification and is a sign of your, oftentimes your likelihood of success, right? So they give it to kids. They go, you want one marshmallow now or you want 2 marshmallows later? And, the kids that delay the gratification tend to go on to be more successful. But they also found something common between the kids that didn't delay the gratification, and it's that they came from different environments, right? An environment where they don't trust you. When you say, they don't trust adults or authority figures that say, if you do this, you'll get this payoff. And so you understand, you take that to understand, the whole school system is made up nonsense, right? It's like, hey, if you study and work hard, you'll get these grades, which don't mean anything, but actually they do mean things. Then you'll get into a different school where you play this game again. Then you get into a different school, you play this game again. And eventually you'll get better preferential access to jobs and all the things that America promises, but only if you accept this made up construct as being legitimate. And you not only accept it as legitimate, you act as if it's legitimate and you trust it. Right? And so if you have been repeatedly lied, if you look around you and you see the wrong side of America, you quote that great Langston Hughes poem, if you have a different view of what America is, you're like, why would I do my homework? Why would I want to graduate with good grades? Why would I trust that if I finish high school and then mortgage my future to go to college, it'll all work out for me? Everything else you've told me has been a lie or has been an illusion. And so you get that cynicism and that disinterest in following the laws or trusting it. And then we blame it on the person and say, they're lacking in virtue or self-control or ambition or, initiative or whatever. But really, they're responding quite rationally to the truth of what the system is. And we have just been given a privileged, unrepresentative version of that same system.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That makes a lot of sense. I think I have read that about the marshmallow test, that actually, if you don't believe the person who says you're going to get 2 marshmallows, then the rational thing to do is to grab what you can. Yeah. That's the short-term gratification, utility maximization that is rational, but it also leads to all of the collective action problems, and then society falls apart.
Yes.
But the point that this is not a failure of will on the part of the individual, but a rational reaction to what society has taught them.
Yes.
Is very powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I find that even with some of the discussions about, the 1619 Project or critical race theory, some of these sort of views of history, your whole book is about the stories we tell ourselves. And you look at some of these stories and you go, you're ripping out the hope, you're ripping out the good things, you're showing only the bad things. It's a sort of a jaundiced or a cynical view. You're tearing things down. And yet it's also not untrue, right? Like the more you study history and you dive deeper into this stuff, sometimes I go, actually, I'm not sure they're going far enough. I think it's worse. You know what I mean? It's like when you look at what Reconstruction could have been and then how it ended, when you look at how segregation wasn't you drink at this water fountain and I drink at this water fountain. It was, if you even look at my water fountain, I will kill your entire family. I will cut off your genitals and stuff them in your mouth, and then I will kill you, and then you will try to file charges, and I will show you that I also control the local and the federal legal system. And, it's so bad that it's hard to look at it and not lose any of the high-minded stuff at all.
Yeah, right. It's hard to look at it and not sort of feel like you're being a fool.
Yes, that's why I think he called it like a fool's errand. Like you think you think back to what the legal system was like for veteran. Like you think about what the legal system was. You fight in World War II. You leave the segregated South. You fight in World War II. You come home, and like some local sheriff just pokes out both of your eyes, or and then gets off. Yeah. Like that was the American legal system, like when my grandfather was alive.
Right.
Not like an isolated incident either, but like very common.
Yeah. No, very common in reaction to Black military service, because that's the promise of equality. Like that's the path to full citizenship. So that was actually something that was very triggering.
Yes. No, you talked about that in the book, that basically Black veterans are not just triggering in the sense that there's this kind of overreaction in the South, but that it's also what those overreactions prompt the Northern overreaction. Like even in someone like Harry Truman. Like Harry Truman is a racist raised by racists, right? Like his mother won't stay in the Lincoln bedroom when he's president. And so he obviously knew what the South was. He knew that what sort of day-to-day white supremacy, the status quo was. And he wasn't super bothered by it. Like he seemed like a decent person, but he wasn't super bothered by it. But it wasn't until a handful of veterans, Black, and then also some Native Americans, who are so mistreated by the system that he goes, okay, that's enough, right? Like you've overdone it. And that's when he gets involved. And so they really do spur kind of this, maybe you call it a third founding of America, which is what the civil rights movement is to me.
Yeah, I mean, I call it the second Reconstruction. I think of this as like cycles.
Yeah.
There are these two different ideologies basically in America, and they rotate. And we have sort of brief moments when we move towards equality, and then there's a backlash that always lasts a lot longer. So I think of like the civil rights movement as the second Reconstruction. I think of the period following that, starting in about 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, as the second redemption. Mm-hmm. So redemption is what we call the overthrow of Reconstruction. And I think like that's the moment that we're in now. And that explains what the Supreme Court is doing in the Voting Rights Act. And that explains Supreme Court decisions against affirmative action. It's a rollback of the gains of the civil rights movement.
And you're starting to see the outcroppings of people reacting to the reaction. This is what the protests after George Floyd, this is what Black Lives, this is people starting to develop a coalition again to say, are we going to do this? Like, are we going to do something about this? Or are we going to cede the fields to the people who seem like they care a lot more than we do?
Right. So maybe it's the beginning of the third Reconstruction. I mean, historically, if it's 100-year cycles, we're a little early. We're going to have to wait like another 20 years. But who knows?
Yes.
Maybe we can go faster this time.
Maybe, hopefully. But also, I think what's interesting, I was going to ask you about that. Like, it is remarkable that the lost cause mythology and that school of history, which down even to my generation, a lot of what we learn is the descendants of that, how much that comes from the North, from the Northern institutions. Like at one point,
like Kennedy,
when Kennedy is fighting against these recalcitrant Southern governors, he basically goes, maybe my Harvard professors didn't explain the Civil War like properly to me. Like he would, because all those guys, those were the guys that were writing biographies of Lee, and like if you think about when Kennedy went to school, like that idea had captured. We talk about how now the conservative trope is that these sort of higher ed has been captured by this certain ideology. Actually, historically, those institutions were captured by a very different ideology for a good chunk of American history. But how it is strange how pervasive those ideas came from sort of northern elite institutions. You know what I mean? It's not like the South was churning out these thinkers necessarily, but
yeah, well, I mean, so some of them were from the South, but definitely the North was willing to go along with that in the name of unity.
yeah,
Because the whole task, I think, that intellectuals have felt they're faced with is finding a story that will bring Americans together. And so the idea, it just sort of depends on which Americans you're trying to bring together. But so the idea, like, America's founded in 1776 and everyone's great, and then we split apart into the North and South. And when you say it that way, the North and the South, it sounds like those are two equally legitimate parts.
yes,
Right? If you say we split apart into the United States and traitors,
yes,
then it sounds a bit different, right?
Right.
But so we say North and South, the North and South split apart, and then they reconcile, and basically they reconcile with the overthrow of Reconstruction, right? Because that's what happens.
right,
And so that's the story that we tell, like the birth of America, the birth of our modern America is like 1876. And there's that painting, The Spirit of 1776, The Spirit of 76. It's painted in 1876. It goes around the country as a way to unite Americans in the name of the founding. But what's really being restored is the racial hierarchy. And so we go along with that. Like, we have this idea that telling a story where Reconstruction was a mistake and its overthrow restored the natural order of things, that will bring Americans together and we can move forward. And that's what we do up until like the 1950s. And it does produce a stable society
yes,
with, you know, a relative absence of conflict, but it's built on, as you said, racial violence and lynching. And the stability is just that dissent is suppressed
yeah,
in this hierarchical society. And then you get the civil rights movement, and the story is sort of disrupted, and people are like, well, this isn't really working. We can't focus on 1876 as our unifying moment. That's, I think, when we start looking back to 1776, and we're like, you know, we have to accept the values of Reconstruction. We do believe in equality. We're going to say we believe in equality, but we don't want to say the 14th Amendment and the Gettysburg Address, because that upsets people in the South. So we're going to say 1776 and the Declaration of Independence.
yeah. There at one point, one of the sort of peace offerings from the South, I think it's Alexander Stevens, maybe, they go to Lincoln, hey, I know we're fighting this like terrible war, but what if we hit pause on it and we invade Mexico instead? Right? They were proposing a war because the French are then fucking around in Mexico, right? Emperor Maximilian or whatever. So they go, what if we reunite and we wage war on someone else? And that seems like insane, obviously, right? And effectively, though, like, you're dating this sort of reconciliation of America to Reconstruction. You could also go, it's just a little while later during Theodore Roosevelt's time when we attack Spain. That's what brings us together. We fight this war, and there's war heroes from the North and the South that come. We're sort of, we focus, we just look towards the ocean, right? And then that's also what makes us an empire. And then shortly thereafter, we have this sort of colonial war in the Philippines. We're sort of bound together by the fact that we've got all these external, we've got the problems of empire, which is also a really ancient kind of historical idea, right? The emperor would go, hey, things aren't going so well in Rome. Let's go over here, right? And so, you know, we fancy ourselves so different, but it is kind of strange how you can cross your eyes just a little bit and see that that's how it went.
It's the same moves over and over again. Like, the external enemy brings us together.
Yeah. Blood and circuses.
Yeah.
Just like, let's get distracted by something. And that's what happened. It almost doesn't feel like that. Like, you go, oh, did they think that would work? And then that is what happened, right? Like, no, the North held out. They understood they had better resources, and, you know, their strategy was more sound. They held out, but they won the other part of the war the other way.
Yeah, they won the battle for historical memory.
Yeah. It is crazy. I was going to tell you another thing I was thinking of. I wrote this down, but we were talking about generations. I saw this meme actually last night, and it was apparently Ulysses S. Grant, his great grandson, is an author, and his great great grandson is an author also. And the joke was, I will study war so my son can study the law, so my son can study art, so his son can write gay vampire novels, which is what he writes about.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I just thought it was like so perfect, just the arc of the generations. And it is interesting how the stakes of the stuff kind of get lower, like they become less existential.
Yeah.
But then also like that's the arc of one historic family.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Well, I want to write a vampire novel.
You should.
Actually, the next novel I write, as soon as I have time, it's going to be vampires.
Really?
Not gay vampires.
See?
Or maybe gay vampires. I haven't committed on that.
I think if you live forever, you just end up trying everything.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
so you studied philosophy, right? If you were going to be a philosopher? Is that what you wanted to do?
I wanted to be a novelist, but I thought that teaching would be a good way to do that with a little bit more security.
Yeah.
So I wanted to teach, and I was trying to decide between law school and graduate school in philosophy. And my parents basically talked me into law school.
Because it's more practical.
Yeah, what they said was it's actually easier to get a law teaching job than a philosophy teaching job, which is true. There's very few philosophy slots that open up. And if you do get a teaching job, you'll be working on things that matter to people, which at the time I didn't really care about as much. I was like, wow, but philosophy is so interesting.
Yeah.
And philosophy can actually transform people's lives, of course. But professional philosophers tend to write on topics that are pretty narrow and inaccessible. So they were right about that. And then they also said, and if you don't get a teaching job, your law degree is worth something, whereas your philosophy PhD is not going to do much for you if you're not teaching philosophy. So all of that made sense. And I went to law school. And I'm really happy with the way it worked out, actually, because now I do feel like I'm working on topics that matter, and I'm trying to say things that could have some impact.
It's kind of an indictment of what philosophy is, both academically and culturally, though. Like the idea is like you would study philosophy if you just want to live in a world of ideas, but you study the law if you want to participate in society, you want to make a difference, you want to help people. The Greeks or the Romans would have found that to be a strange state of affairs, I feel like.
Right. Well, so I think, what people would say about that is philosophy doesn't touch people's everyday lives, but you're always being affected by the law, right?
Yeah.
And then the answer to that is, well, philosophy is touching your life. You just don't realize it.
Yes.
Because you haven't been sensitized to the role that philosophy plays. And I think actually Stanley Cavell, a Harvard philosopher, wrote something very much like that in The Claim of Reason. But I don't think that it went that far outside academic circles.
Yeah.
Is the thing. I mean, professional academic philosophy is kind of insular.
Yeah. I mean, in the ancient world, philosophy was about sort of practical questions and about how you lived. It was closer to a system of ethics and a kind of a civic religion. And then as it becomes more abstract, theoretical, and academic, it becomes about these questions that feel like they don't pertain to everyday life. And it's true, a lot of them don't. But then it's sort of like, well, what is helping people answer those questions? It's nothing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, like, so I'm doing this series of books now on the cardinal virtues. So I did courage. Courage is kind of straight down the middle. Everyone knows why courage is important. I did discipline. Everyone wishes they had more discipline. They understand what discipline does. And then as I've started to write about justice, you bump into this thing, which is, it's not just that justice to people feels like the legal system or politics, but it's almost like if you call someone a social justice warrior, that's like an insult. Like, what does that say about where we are as a society, that that justice not only feels kind of like this one partial domain of life, like justice only comes into play when you commit a crime or break a law, or you get a letter from a lawyer, as opposed to justice. And I think by extension, philosophy as a whole, that it's this thing that pertains to all the decisions you make, like what kind of car you drive, or how you treat people, or, what business you enter, right? Like that.
Yeah.
Actually, it's supposed to help us with all these questions. This is where it's supposed to help us derive not just knowledge, but also values.
Right. But how can we get a broader engagement with that?
I'm trying, man. I'm trying.
Right.
That's what I do.
That is great. No, that's great.
Yeah, no, it's good.
I love what you do. Actually, like I hadn't known that much about it, but everyone I talked to was like, "Oh my God, the Daily Stoic, that's amazing." And I was like, "Wow, really?"
It's funny because that's certainly not like what the reaction from my publisher was when I was like, I want to do this book on Stoicism.
Yeah.
They were like, but you write marketing books. Isn't that what you should keep doing? And it turns out that I think people are well aware that this is a part of society and ourselves that is neglected. Like the sort of the answers to the big questions as well as guidance in the practical matters, which I think that's the philosophy that I think people get excited about. I mean, like there are interesting questions, the trolley problem and,
right.
How do we know we're not living in a computer simulation? But like philosophy also helps us with some slightly more practical matters, as well as just things like you're going to die. What does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah, the philosophy that I was studying in college was not that practical.
Yeah.
I think it was like philosophy of language, philosophy of mind.
Yes. A lot of German names that are hard to pronounce.
Wittgenstein.
Yes.
Yeah. Frege. Yeah. And the are we brains in a vat, which is basically the are we in a computer simulation. Yeah.
Yeah. And what am I supposed to, let's say you told me yes or no. What am I supposed to do with this information? Like how does that help me with anything?
Right.
I'm not sure that it does. It's interesting, but it kind of, it gets like, how many angels could fit on the head of a pin?
Yeah.
And I think maybe part of it also is that religion answers those questions for a lot of people. And religion has, for the most part, done a pretty good job of selling itself as the answer to those questions.
Yeah, religion's done a very good job of selling itself.
It stepped in and it filled the void.
Well, also religion, I think, to go back to something that I was saying earlier, religion fits into this agency detector slot that people have in their minds where you're like, there are these patterns in the world, something's causing it.
Sure.
It's a supernatural religious entity. So it's sort of, it naturally appeals to people.
How did we get here? Someone or something must have put us here.
Right.
Yeah.
Although there's something strange about how willing people are to accept that. They're like, I must have come from somewhere. The answer is God. But then like, where did God come from?
Right.
Well, God is the first cause, right? The unmoved mover. But why does that seem like an answer? I don't know.
Yeah, Pete Holmes was, the comedian, had this joke in his most recent special about how atheists and religious people essentially come to the same conclusion, which is an atheist is saying like we come from nothing. And then a religious person is saying that God is everything and also nothing. And so same thing.
Right.
I thought that was interesting. But it is weird about philosophy. And it's just not, it's not, maybe, I actually have this, I've been working on this idea that I think a big part of it is that people used to learn Greek and Latin, right? Which nobody taught me. And when they teach you Greek and Latin, one of the only ways to do that for most of human history was to have you read the people who wrote in Greek and Latin, which were the philosophers, right? So you're like, when I learned Spanish, it's like Paul goes to his house, or, like I have pants, it's like these not super interesting, basic rudimentary ways of stringing a question together. But the way Latin and Greek were taught were like, memorize this passage from Cicero, or here's an epigram from Seneca, right?
Yeah.
And so you're being forcibly introduced to some actually pretty intriguing or interesting ideas that are loaded with a lot of the bedrock assumptions of Western civilization. And when that slowly goes away, there's sort of a void left behind.
Yeah. I only took 2 years of Latin. But my Latin teacher did, in fact, give me little epigrams to translate as like extra credit exercises sometimes. And I remember like, carry on and be strong. This pain will be useful to you. I actually used to repeat that to myself.
And I mean, that's how like Julius Caesar would have been taught Latin.
Yeah.
That's a pretty ancient, not particularly innovative, but continuous tradition that went on for like 2,000 plus years that just kind of disappeared sometime in like, the mid 20th century permanently?
Yeah. People still take Greek and Latin. They still have Latin Day at my kids' school.
But a very small minority.
Yeah, it's definitely shrunk.
Like, I mean, when you see these like Latin expressions on the classical buildings and stuff, you're like, in America, they would have expected that people could read those or know what was happening. Or like even I always think it's interesting, reading some like Penguin Classics thing, and there will just be like untranslated chunks of, some poem in Greek or Latin. And,
right.
and Montaigne is assuming that not only that you can translate this, but that you recognize it's Virgil.
Yeah.
And not only do we not recognize the language, but we definitely don't recognize what work it's from because we weren't taught it that same way.
Yeah.
But if you quoted Scarface, maybe a teenager would recognize it.
Well, maybe. But I mean, now I think less and less, like it used to be, at least people would know Shakespeare.
Sure.
And now it's all STEM. Now we don't have English majors anymore.
Yeah.
Which I think is a real loss.
I was talking to my wife about that, like Taylor Swift is the biggest thing in the world, right?
Yeah.
But that's how society is supposed to be. Like in the sense that there's supposed to be forms of art or artists or plays or works that everyone knows, right? And that's where culture is derived from, is the ability to make like Lincoln, he'd made quotes sometimes, but like you look at his addresses and huge chunks of them are allusions, riffing on the Bible, classical works, but these are unattributed allusions. The mystic chords of memory, or better angels of our nature, judge not lest you be judged. People know what he's doing there because they're all sharing this common culture. It's not that we should have some sort of forced common culture, but it's I guess what I'm saying is that this is not even an academic or a school criticism. It's that as culture has fragmented because there's an unlimited amount of options, even the stuff that's really popular is capturing only a small percentage of the population at any given time. And so you don't have the ability to create reference points or allude to ideas that everyone intuitively gets.
Yeah, exactly. So I teach a creative writing seminar at the law school.
Yeah.
And very often I'm trying to talk about a particular technique, like, where you build up this backstory and then you reveal that this backstory was actually a lie and there's this underlying world. And so I try to give an example of that, and it's so hard to find something that everyone in the class knows. Yes. Like I can get like 3 people with Star Wars.
Yes.
And I can get 4 other people with Twilight or something like that. But there just isn't this common set of works that we can refer to and sort of build on in our discussions.
Right. Yeah. Like I've been telling the story, but one of my sons he's gotten into Greek mythology. So he's like, he loves like the Odyssey. And there's something remarkable about the fact that I could tell him the story of the Odyssey basically from memory, having learned it. But that is a very old tradition. I mean, for thousands of years, that's true. But you could count on your hand, the other works that you could do that for, right? Where everyone knows, right? And that everyone has been doing it generation after generation, and it compounds and compounds and compounds the more people know and reference the same stuff. Like Harry Potter is maybe one of the recent additions to like the children's canon. And
Right.
it's not the same level, right? But that the idea of like having these sort of cultural reference points that everyone knows. And like, I think about it, like how many people know about the Stoics, or when I talk about Marcus Aurelius, they just know that because the movie Gladiator was famous 20 years ago. And then I remember I was talking to this guy who's a football player, and he goes, "Hey, I love this stuff from the Stoics. Like, are there any movies about the Stoics?" And I go, "Well, there is this movie Gladiator." And he was like, "Oh, I have to check that out."
Yeah.
And I go, "What? What do you mean?" And then I realized it came out when he was 1 year old.
Right. Yeah. No, with my students, part of it is that I'm just aging out of their demographics.
Yes.
But also they don't seem to share it with each other. So it's not like there's something that they all know that I don't.
Yes.
They just don't have anything in common.
Right. Except Taylor Swift.
Yes. Well, I'm a Swiftie too. Like everyone. Yeah. Everyone loves Taylor Swift.
But there's something magical about that. Like there's something magical about 60,000 people attending the same thing. Right. And the one tour being the thing that everyone's talking about, and the like.
And the movie that you can all see. Because
Yes.
this is part of the problem that we have politically.
Yes.
I think that everyone is getting different information from different information sources.
Well, one argument I heard that I thought was interesting is understanding Trump as a phenomenon like that. So there aren't many mass cultural events anymore. Taylor Swift being a good example of a recent one, but or the Barbie movie being a recent one. But again, these are like exceptions that prove the rule, right? But like Trump is a national/international phenomenon that people are liking the community of. Like, put aside the repugnant political beliefs. Going to a rally with 50,000 people. What other rallies have 50,000 people? Like, it's not put aside politics. And there's not even like big revival movements. Like, you think about the Great Awakening in the American history. There were these events where things like that happened, where people would go do these things. You look at baseball stadiums when the games are televised, and there's like 10,000 people in a 40,000 seat stadium, right? Like even
that's sad.
These pastimes are not what they were. So they're not shared, right? Like, I read somewhere like the single best time to have a heart attack in New York City was while the finale of Seinfeld was being aired, because
no traffic. Yeah.
But like no other show since has wrapped up in such a big way. Or Matthew Perry died. There's not going to be actors like that anymore, in the sense of a show where a regular episode is being watched by tens of millions of people. So you lack the ability to create or draw on shared frames of reference because you don't have a mass culture. So Trump is one of the few mass cultural events. Like, I think that's why people have the flags. Even like, you think, like I was talking to someone when did flags become a form of political expression again? Right? Like, it's strange, but then you realize, oh no, that's a way of saying like, I belong to this group. Even though that group is repugnant in my view, people are saying like, I want to be a part of something. And they know that you know what the flag means.
Well, yeah. Do you mean the Trump flags or the American flags?
I mean the Trump flag. But
yeah, the Trump flag is terrible. That's like the most un-American thing imaginable. It's like putting a person's name on the flag, because we're not supposed to be loyal to people.
But have you also noticed that as they made the Confederate flag more and more sort of politically incorrect, some of those same people just wave the regular flag now, the regular flag.
Yeah.
But with the same kind of menacing intent? That's odd.
Well, I mean, one of the things that saddens me so much is the changing meaning of the American flag. Mm-hmm. And so to some extent, people were doing this with the Betsy Ross flag. And I'm like, legitimately, I have some reservations about the Betsy Ross flag, right? 13 stars in a circle. Every star represents a slave state. Yeah. That's the first flag of the Confederacy, too. It looks almost the same. Yeah. But the idea that the American flag is like a divisive flag for Americans is very sad to me. But like, that's how it's being used. It's like this.
Like, I live out in the country. My neighbor has this big ass truck. And on the weekends, he puts an American flag and a special flag holder in the back, sometimes a Trump flag, and he just drives around with it. And you're like, what is that? What is he trying to accomplish? What's going on there, right? Like, what is that? What is it doing for him? And it's belonging to something, but it's about drawing on and expressing oneself through a symbol. And symbols are very, very powerful. And I think the quote unquote good guys don't have that many symbols and aren't very adept at speaking through and creating symbols.
Yeah, well, we need a better flag.
How so?
Well, I'm trying to think of a flag that would be inclusive rather than divisive and threatening. Because I think like a lot of people, I feel sort of like the really assertive American flag waving people, I find that kind of menacing because it's aggressive.
Well, yeah,
it's like we're the in group and you're the out group.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then people don't like the pride flag.
Right. Exactly. So then like there's the pride flag and then the pride flag gets you attacked.
Yeah. But I think I think Theodore Roosevelt was good at understanding symbols, right? Or finding things that bind people together. National parks being a good example, right? Like finding the ability
the national
to
parks are the perfect example because that's inclusive.
Yes.
The whole idea there is this is something that is for everyone. This is something that we have in common.
Except for the Native Americans that it was stolen from, but...
Yeah. No, yes. A lot of times, like I think I've come up with some great story about America and then people are like, and what about the Native Americans? And I'm like, yeah, that was bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like I thought that a little bit during the Maui wildfires, how people are, obviously the native people there are sort of upset with what's happening and they're talking about, and then people here sort of repeating what they're saying. And it's like, what happened there isn't that different than what happened here too. It was just slightly more recent.
Right.
Like, so the more you dig into it, it's so, this idea of negative capability, Keats talks about it, Fitzgerald talks about it. Basically, it's the ability to hold contradictory ideas in your head at the same time.
Yeah.
You can't survive / understand / be good in American life without the ability to hold these wildly contradictory notions in your head. Like you're talking about stories in your book. You really have to be able to understand multiple simultaneous stories because different people were having very different experiences and different things meant different things to different people.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's easier a lot of times just to forget some of them. And we suppress them.
When then certain people's viewpoint is, we can't talk about these things. And by you repeatedly bringing them up, you're making things hard on me or them or whatever. So stop. Like, let's just all agree on a simple, unpleasant version of the story and then ignore the other stuff.
Right. Well, it is hard on them. I mean, I think it's hard to try to hold these contradictory ideas in your mind because there is a sort of natural tendency to try to make things coherent and have a worldview that makes sense. And so you kind of squeeze out the inconvenient splinter, even if it's a splinter of truth.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance is the thing we're always fighting, always.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's tough. It's really tough. But you have to sort of swim against that tide. Like, I heard someone say once, like, if it's pleasant, it's probably not history. Like, if the narrative is reassuring or clarifying to you, you're probably not anywhere near history. You're somewhere in the realm of propaganda or fiction or story.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, on the other hand, I think that stories are very valuable and helpful. Mm-hmm. Even though they're not completely true and they do have an ideological angle.
Well, because if you don't have them, what do you have?
Right. This is what brings us together.
Yeah.
And the stories teach you virtue. Mm-hmm. We have these ideas about what it means to be a good American.
Or a good person.
Or a good person.
Yeah, there was the line from one of Roosevelt's early biographers. He said he grew up reading about great men and decided to be just like them. And a child needs that. I mean, people need that. A country needs that. A team needs that. Like, if you don't have the sense of what you're aspiring to be, what do you have? You have sort of cynicism and nihilism. You have nothing. And so you need these stories to inspire you, to show you what's possible, to measure yourself against. The problem is, if you're intellectually honest or have any kind of self-awareness, the closer you get to the story, the more you explore them, they crumble a little bit. They show themselves to be more complicated, right? Theodore Roosevelt himself being a great example. If you just look at him as the strenuous life, great American president, there's a lot to like, but then you kind of dig in more and there's a lot not to like, and then you dig in more and then you find other stuff you like that you didn't know you would like.
Yeah, I mean, there are different angles. Theodore Roosevelt contained multitudes. And I think, we can learn from his mistakes too. We can learn from his weaknesses because it shows us that no one's perfect and that people have particular kinds of blind spots, and sometimes their strengths turn into weaknesses in some ways. And all of that, I think, is good perspective. I mean, it does complicate it. You don't necessarily want that all at once. I think maybe your first exposure to Theodore Roosevelt when you're a child could be like the teddy bear story.
Yes.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, even he's hunting with Leroy Percy, who's an avowed segregationist, and also, they're just hunting a bear, which was quickly thereafter hunted nearly to extinction. So even just like you're poking around in that story, it's a little strange.
So if you poke around in that story, it turns out to be not very accurate the way that it's traditionally told, because he did refuse to shoot the bear, but then they killed the bear anyway and they ate it.
Somebody else just shot it. Yeah, it's just the kind of like, I'm not personally going to do it.
Yeah.
I won't get my hands dirty, but I will eat it.
I'm not the kind of person who would do that thing.
Yes.
But someone else can.
Yes. I met a guy, he was born in Bastrop County. He lived in Austin. His name was Richard Overton. He died maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But he was born during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. He was the oldest man in the world when he died.
Oh, wow.
So like it feels, you know what I mean? Like it feels great seems like it would make sense. And then also, so history feels, I guess what I'm saying is history feels like very far away. And then it's also sometimes like one life or two life to go back to it.
Yeah, there are people who've lived through things that seem like incredibly remote.
Yes.
Looking back on it.
Well, I heard this other weird one. This is me just nerding out a little bit. But okay, so Jimmy Buffett wrote Margaritaville in Austin. He ate at this Mexican restaurant in Austin that was the first or second place to have a margarita machine. But that's not what's weird about this story. What blew my mind is it was owned by the grandson of this guy named Joe. And Joe had come to America from China to build the railroads in the 1870s.
Wow.
So you go Margaritaville, which feels like this modern beach song, is like 2 handshakes away from importing immigrant labor to build the railroads in this country.
Yeah. Well, we're a pretty young country when you think about it.
Yeah. I mean, even the Roosevelt name goes back basically before the U.S., right?
Oh, yeah.
Like pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And yeah, we tend like that was, so it was weird to meet Richard and go, okay, this guy goes like he was the oldest living veteran when he died in the United States. And I was like, well, who was the oldest living veteran when he was born? And it was like a guy in the Black Hawk War.
Yeah,
which Lincoln fought in. Yeah. And so like, you think it's all very distant, and then it's actually not that distant. And then that ties into the ideas in your book, which is like, this story is not this thing that's been written. It's not like the Odyssey that was written like thousands of years ago and is passed down to us. It's like still being written. And some of the people who wrote big chunks of it, not good chunks, but big chunks of it are like still here. And you realize like they were just making it up. Yeah.
Well, I think about that too when I think about historical moments that I lived through that now seem so distant to my students. And I'm like, the 80s when I was a kid are now as far away from us as the 40s were.
Yes.
When I was growing up, which just doesn't seem possible.
Well, I get that we have some like high school kids that work in the bookstore and realizing like to them, clothes from the 90s are retro
Right.
and cool again. And to them, or those clothes are as distant to them as hippie clothes were to me in the 90s.
Yeah. I feel like it's different somehow, though. Like
The time is sped
30
up?
years doesn't mean as much as it used to. Because like the year 2000, I feel like that's still sort of the modern world.
Sure.
Whereas when I was young, like the 60s, I was like, oh, that's so old.
But don't you think that's actually something that we forget about the past, which is like how things that had finished were or were in the past were in distant memory to those people. So like we go, okay, this was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And then, so you go, yeah, in the 1840s or, you know, as they're, let's say in the lead up to the Civil War, as they're sort of hammering these things out, like the founding of the country itself is not this far off, like ossified permanent thing.
Yeah.
But like a thing that their parents did or their parents' parents did, and therefore isn't really as set in stone as it feels like to us.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So in the antebellum period, it's like 50 years ago. It's, you know, definitely their grandparents were there.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that they had a just really different conception of the founding, I think, than we do now, which is exactly what you were saying, which is it's this dynamic moment when there are lots of different understandings of how society should be organized and what political concepts mean out there.
Yes.
And it's not like this single moment that we can look back at
Yes.
and find the one objective true meaning of things.
Well, this was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting.